The other thing that always gets raised, and we really have to tackle, is regulation, the burden of regulation. I find it slightly wearisome that every time I meet a business audience in the Chamber of Commerce, say, and you ask what the biggest problem is, they start going on about bureaucracy and red tape and the cost, in both financially and in management time, of the growing burden of regulation. Weary because I've run out of counting the number of times I've heard politicians promise bonfires of red tape and the like. Very little has been achieved, and the situation gets steadily worse, in my opinion. And what is required is a process, which we're working on, which will actually produce the change in practice, eventually one hopes the change in culture, that will stop us actually imposing these burdens on business as we do. The starting point it's absolutely essential, of course, to take for granted you're maintaining essential standards of health, safety, probity, which the public demand. To do that, you do not acquire the bureaucratic approach to it, which comes instinctively to large parts of our system in this country. You do not require large numbers of competing agencies with regulatory powers extending their role. You do not require such formal and bureaucratic methods of doing it. The multiple inspectorates, which in the public sector, as much as the private sector, people are exposed to. And we continue to add detail to what we have set out in our deregulation document as about how to get the cost and the burden down. Our principal problem in office will no doubt be some of our colleagues in other departments and the natural culture of Whitehall, where you make a name for yourself by actually introducing a further protection to the public and creating a new agency and responding to the latest incident in the newspapers with a whole new set of powers and all the rest of it. One of the things we are proposing is a system of regulatory government, which, to be fair, the present government was working on at one stage. I don't know why they dropped it. They've never given any explanation. But actually, if you want, if it's a case for a new regulatory system to be introduced, make a proper assessment of what the cost of compliance is going to be in private business in particular. When you calculated the cost, trade in by looking across the system for some regulatory system that can be improved or is no longer required, something you can drop of equivalent cost. Quite a tall order, can be done, and actually will have an amazingly constraining effect upon the instinct to ever more elaborate regulation which we have in this country. The very agencies themselves, of all kinds, not just the regulatory ones, but particularly the regulatory ones, which have to justify their existence once in a while, every 5 years, we have proposed. Many quangos are created, very few ever disappear. You can put in place the most entrepreneurial chairman who's offered to help you from the private sector, and within 6 months, is my experience, he's usually gone native, is complaining about the inadequacy of the headquarters, and is discussing with his chief executive how the scope of what they're doing can be extended. Well, let us do that properly. Let's have people in and say, now, what have you achieved in the last 5 years? Is that purpose still there? Is what you're doing and the way you're doing it in proportion to the public benefit that you're actually producing? Are you overlapping and competing with some rival agency of government? And rationalise the system. There are some organisations are set up for a very good purpose, do a very good job, and when they've finished it, think of something else to do, and even campaign to be allowed to do so. It's not just a question, going back to the big overriding question of public expenditure and cost. And I actually read on the train this morning that someone's just surveyed the quangocracy and found that the actual public expenditure cost has been racing ahead in the last few years. The factor in a recession hasn't got through to many of these great public bodies. This does have to be tackled, and it's part of our deregulation policy in particular. And then, if you can tackle the tax, the regulatory problems, which are an essential part of whether the UK as a whole is an attractive place to do business and a competitive base, then you look at the things you can actually do to stimulate growth in particular areas. I quite agree with the vital role of the universities, higher education in general. We have a huge problem in producing the required numbers of the high-quality people in the key science, engineering, technical, mathematical areas where we do produce excellent people. We have best of our higher education system is one of the best in the world, but we need to stimulate, firstly, continued production of the quantity of people we require, but also the links between business and higher education going well beyond the educational function, so that the best of what is produced, the best innovations from our laboratories, from our engineering faculties, actually have a tie-in to business, have access to the finance, the venture capital that they require, so that the exploitation and development of innovation actually takes place in the United Kingdom. And there are good examples already, but they're tiny and not big enough. They're miles behind what you would find if you went to North America, which need to be stimulated and supported and helped. And we have at the moment Sir James Dyson, whose vacuum cleaners are renowned and whose hand drivers in the loo are among the great technological breakthroughs of the last few years. But he's a very distinguished guy, and he and a lot of other people helping him are preparing for us advice on how, again, looking to Britain in the future and manufacturing in the future, which is very important to regions with such a manufacturing tradition and the right kind of skills and experience here to be retrained and available. How are we going to stimulate Britain? We've set ourselves the modest aim of becoming the biggest exporter of high-tech products in Western Europe, which will take a bit, but is perfectly attainable if we can reverse decline and actually get ourselves growing again. As far as local business support is concerned, that's absolutely vital. We are extremely keen on business development and regeneration. We were very keen when we were in office. It's one of the cliches of exchanges to say somehow the sort of Thatcher years, when in my opinion we were turned into a competitive economic country for the first time for a very long time, was near when all these things were neglected. I think if you tried to explain that to Michael Heseltine, he'd be rather surprised and more indignant than I become. I'm beyond indignation. But what matters, and I do agree with what's been said, is that you need local partnership between business leaders and local authority leaders to achieve the best way forward, and that we are going to concentrate on. We're actually going to leave more local choice to how it should be organised and done, but plainly the financing needs to be targeted in that direction in support of well-judged organisations that can promote that and take it forward, and that we will actually be doing. And we have produced arguments about that. We're having a look at the present sort of somewhat erratic distribution of responsibilities, which has come over the last few years, and we are going to decide which need to be reorganised, but also how far we can follow through on our emphasis that in the end we think it's for the local leaders in the community to decide what form of local development partnership or whatever they actually would prefer, take advantage of again, we've got to rationalise the support we give. The DTI, or it might have been DBIR by then, or DBIS by then, had 3,000 separate schemes for supporting business at one point, because every press release produced a new one, and nobody ever abolished an old one. So all this has to be rationalised, not just relabelled, because cost effectiveness, again, is going to be very important in the next 3 or 4 years.